Welcome back to Manufacturing Unscripted. My guest today was Michael Weller, who leads the global manufacturing practice with Verizon Business. We talked about Verizon Business and how they're incorporating wireless infrastructure, private networks, and the next generation of technology to shift how factories operate. We hope you enjoy.
This podcast is sponsored by Promise Incorporated, the leading provider of fully electric servo presses for manufacturing. Promise provides global support for pressing and motion control applications in multiple industries. With precise positioning and in-process force monitoring, your company will begin to see ROI on day one. Call 810-229-9334 or email sales@promiseinc.com to speak with an expert engineer about your application today.
Welcome back to Manufacturing Unscripted. I'm your host, Peter Parsons, and today my guest is Michael Weller, who leads the global manufacturing practice at Verizon Business. It's good to have you here on the show, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Peter. Glad to be here.
To kick things off, would you mind just kind of introducing yourself and what you do at Verizon Business?
Sure. To be honest, I have one of the coolest jobs at Verizon. I go out to manufacturing and industrial customers, and I spend a lot of time understanding the so what part of the Verizon offering. A lot of people get caught up in the technical and the functional tracks, and there's a lot of good reasons to do that. Sometimes what we find is that the business impact track isn't always followed in parallel. And the result is that as innovation projects proceed, there's a realization that, oh, heck, we didn't spend enough time understanding the real business impact that we pass the so what test. So in our group, what we do is we spend a lot of time on the use cases and what problems are we trying to solve for the customer. So as a result, we get to learn about a lot of different challenges that manufacturers are facing. We get to get in there and help them solve those types of problems. And it's a really rewarding, interesting, and fascinating role.
Yeah, and I imagine anytime you're going out and experiencing these unique challenges, that just further strengthens your repertoire kind of going forward.
We hear some amazing stories and meet some amazing people. We have a lot of respect for what manufacturers do and some of the challenges that they're facing today. It's incredible what these people are doing each and every day.
Yeah. So would you be able to maybe cover kind of what specifically makes it the global manufacturing, kind of rather than just what we have locally?
Sure. We're seeing a few global aspects to this. A lot of manufacturers have seen that there's a lot of reshoring going on right now. A lot of, whether it's global manufacturers that are expanding their U.S. presence, or whether it's U.S.-based manufacturers that are returning a lot of their value chain and operations back into the States for supply chain reasons and a host of other reasons. So as a result, what we're seeing is that the explosion of new plant construction that's going on, whether it's for a U.S.-based company or a global company, is significant. Factories that are 250,000 square feet and above, there's an incredible amount of investment being made there. But we're also seeing a lot of modernization of lines, new lines being added. So a tremendous amount of activity. So we'll deal with customers all over the world where they might be focused on a U.S. facility or they might be focused on their global footprint. Verizon has a global presence. While we're best known for what we do in the United States, we have thousands and thousands of employees around the world. While we don't offer the spectrum that we have here in the United States, we're able to do everything else and work closely with the customer for whatever local and in-country spectrum they need to acquire.
Yeah. And would you be able to maybe clarify kind of some of the offerings that Verizon has? At least kind of what comes to mind, I think, for a lot of people is just, cellular networks. And I guess, can you kind of explain how that translates to specific to manufacturing offerings?
Sure. We're best known for our wireless offerings in the consumer space. What's not as well known is that Verizon Business is about a $20 to $25 billion organization with tens of thousands of employees serving global customers. And our product offerings range from security services to SD-WAN services, to unified communications, to contact center, to core networking technologies, including Wi-Fi. So we're in internet access, cloud services. There's the wide range of things where we can support customers to achieve their global ambitions. And that presence that we have worldwide and enables us to do that real effectively.
Yeah, and definitely kind of with the surge in kind of the industry 4.0, that advanced connection within the manufacturing environment, I imagine that kind of lends itself well to what you're able to offer these companies.
One of the things we saw when we started doing 5G was that there was an opportunity in the business space that would be over and above what we're seeing in the consumer space. For a lot of consumers, 4G LTE was really the revolutionary next gen capability in cellular. For enterprises, though, 5G introduces some interesting options that businesses didn't have available before when it comes to wireless. When you think of 5G and the capabilities that it has in terms of bandwidth, in terms of latency, in terms of security and density, it introduces a possibility of an alternative to a wired connection. So while we offer Wi-Fi services and while we offer our macro or public network services, one of the things we found was that the ability to offer a dedicated cellular network to manufacturers was going to be really appealing, giving them a best of both worlds approach. If you consider that most manufacturers rely on a wired connection to most of their devices, systems, motors, all their automation and such, that is inherently secure and reliable, yet there's a cost to that. It's inflexible. It limits agility. It's inordinately expensive at this point, given the cost of copper and the cost of labor to run additional cabling. Yet Wi-Fi, for all of its strengths, isn't as well suited for an industrial environment because of some of those limitations that it has regarding assets that are in motion, security, the number of devices that might be in a located area, the propagation of the signal to all areas of a plant with all the signal sources of interference and things like that. So what we found is that cellular that's dedicated to a manufacturer offers that middle lane between a wired connection and a Wi-Fi connection. So it enables manufacturers to think, okay, as I'm going to add AI use cases, as I'm going to add some of these new innovations that I've been thinking about doing for a while, I don't have to worry that I'm going to overload my existing wired infrastructure or my Wi-Fi infrastructure. I'm able to use something like this that's purpose-built to support AI use cases.
Yeah, and definitely with everything, to the point where it's not just an endpoint of data per unit or per part. You have information and communication at all lines at any point in a factory, where you even might have like handheld tools that are connected to some kind of network that are able to provide some kind of feedback. Definitely just the demand for those kind of specified networks just seems to be exploding right now.
For sure. There's a perception that the cellular company is providing connectivity to a smartphone or perhaps to a tablet or to a laptop. But when you think of the number of end user devices or endpoints that go into a factory environment or a warehouse, it could be scanners, it could be barcode readers, it could be assembly tools, torque wrenches, not to mention cameras, AGVs, AMRs, even fork trucks, anything that moves around in the factory or that is stationary. It could be an IoT sensor. The number of endpoints that could be potentially connected to the tech stack in the OT environment is a very large number at this point. And while not all of them necessarily have a cellular native capability with a SIM card on board, there's lots of ways to approach that. The beauty of this is that all of these devices don't carry their own data plan. There's not a monthly recurring plan in a private wireless solution. It's a fixed recurring cost, which really helps with the economies of scale. So we're finding that the number of endpoints over the last 2 or 3 years is expanding significantly, not just wide with a number of different offerings, but deep, so there's choices within each product category.
Yeah. And at least what kind of comes to mind when I think of, manufacturers trying to modernize is they might be facing one of two roadblocks, where one of which is they might not have the infrastructure to handle kind of adding in all these connections, and the other one where they might just not simply have the budget to be able to afford kind of that improvement to the infrastructure. Is that kind of a common thing that you're seeing, or I guess
Yeah,
maybe more specifically, what can maybe small to mid-sized manufacturers do when they face those hurdles?
I call it innovation in a drawer. Very rarely do we go to a manufacturer and present to them an entirely new idea for how they might create value. They've usually thought of those ideas, but they're concerned that if they do anything more, they're going to either tax their infrastructure too much and have some unintended consequences, or they're going to spend a whole lot of money on inflexible cable-based connections, which may ultimately be limiting as well. And then finding that budget is a challenge because in many respects, the corporate IT department is given the plant floor Wi-Fi connectivity. There's less open-mindedness when it comes to why we put a second network out on the floor. We've got a wired connection. We've got a Wi-Fi network. Do we really need to put a third network in? The reality is that there's significant business value that can be generated with a cellular approach to this because of that, the avoidance of the monthly recurring costs that I talked about, but also the scaling. Even if it's a small to medium-sized manufacturer, when you consider the number of devices that could be added to this, that's either going to be a cable drop or it's going to be some type of Wi-Fi connection with traditional legacy approaches that are going to introduce some trade-offs. And in a lot of cases, whether it's a small plant or a large plant, there's going to be areas that are considered to be dead zones that don't have the coverage. They provide the ability for a worker, either from a safety perspective, a quality perspective, or a productivity or efficiency perspective. There's going to be a trade-off with some of that. So what we're finding is that the budgets for these are very often coming from multiple sources, that OT and IT are sharing in that. There's creative ways to do that when the digital antenna system, the DAS system, perhaps that contract term expires, and there's a way to layer that into a private wireless, into a hybrid approach, which also can be cost justified because we're trading in that DAS system that connected to all the macro carriers, perhaps, and then being able to consolidate the network. So we're actually simplifying in some respects when it comes to private wireless.
Yeah. Would you say that kind of at this point, having these secondary specified networks, it's kind of gone from kind of a novel solution to more so a necessity for manufacturers?
I think that in the next 5 to 7 years, there's going to be one of those realizations among a lot of manufacturers of how do we live without private cellular, that it's going to become mainstream. And we've seen in the last 9 to 12 months, a certain tipping point, a certain realization where I wouldn't say we're mainstream at this point, but I would definitely say we've moved beyond the pioneers and even some of the early adopters. So I think we're into the fast follower stage with the amount of interest, exploration, but also investment. So for the first couple of years, we were having what I would call a lot of interesting conversations. And now I think we're shifting to productive conversations in that it's leading to something where we're actually able to provide value to the customer. And it's going beyond education and socialization of the concepts to, yeah, this has been proven out. There's enough of a critical mass of customers in the manufacturing space. They're already doing it. So the risk profile is better understood. And it's showing that it's driving sufficient business value that I think in the next 2 years, we're going to see a significant uptake in adoption and deployment.
Yeah. And then with these companies, are you talking kind of mainly with like the executive suite, or are you talking specifically with, the people running the IT departments or the people managing the networks?
We're talking to a broad cross-section. What we find is that the people that are living with the daily problems are the plant directors, the plant managers, the engineering teams, the operations teams, the people that have to figure out how are we going to meet our daily goals of safety, of quality, of production, and such. And with that in mind, we're trying to better understand how can we help them solve those problems. So we're engaging in a way we haven't before with the operations people, the people on the floor, but we're partnering with corporate IT groups to better understand how does it all come together? How is this going to be managed on day 2? That collaboration is yielding some powerful partnerships. That leads us to be able to talk to the executive leaders in a more meaningful way because we've made the investment of time to better understand their challenges and issues and how we're going to help them solve their problems. So sometimes we're starting with a leader, sometimes we're starting at the plant level, and sometimes corporate IT is bringing us into those situations. But we have to be aware of all those different communities of interest and making sure that we're speaking their language.
Yeah, because definitely that it always makes me think of, when you might have someone at the top that's advocating for a new process, a new technology, and just kind of thinking on the other end how that's affecting, the plant workers and changing their day-to-day schedules.
Right. And obviously one of those is with AI. And there's so much buzz going on about AI, and everybody's dipping their toe into that pool for a lot of very good reasons. It's sometimes that executive leader says, okay, we've got to do something with AI, but the practical reality on the floor is that there are processes that have to be changed. There's people that have to be trained. There's a lot of additional work to enable AI to be fully realized. So and it's back to that innovation conversation before, there's incremental improvement, there's innovation, and there's transformation, and understanding what that executive really wants to do. Are we trying to check off the box for AI? Are we really trying to change our business in a radical way? Are we trying to do something innovative, something that might be in between all of that? So understanding where the customer is trying to land with that becomes critical. And I'll give you an example of this. We had the opportunity to listen to a chief C-level person, if you will, of a large manufacturer at a conference. And he talked about how they were going to be providing tablets to their people to be able to take advantage of all these new use cases and streamline their efficiencies out on the floor, and how fantastic it was going to be. The very next day, we had a chance to tour that very plant. And what we saw was all those tablets that were glowingly spoken about the day before, they were sitting in brackets gathering dust because there were so many dead zones in the plant that the tablets couldn't be relied upon as a primary source of interaction. Sure, there were probably some training issues and some adaptation issues with behaviors and all of that were part of it. But the lack of connectivity gave all of the people that were slow to adopt this type of technology, it gives them a great excuse to not use it and to fall back into old patterns and behaviors.
Yeah, I think definitely with, a new technology, a new application, a new, change to your schedule, if you can kind of poke the holes in it, if you can find a way to kind of justify, not using it or kind of to argue against it, I think it's definitely kind of counterproductive just to everything as a whole, especially, when this is kind of hailed as the next big change for the facility.
Yes. And there's a lot of obvious concerns about the displacement factor associated with AI. What gets really interesting, what the leading manufacturers are really starting to think deeply about, is this type of new technology, for the first time, is not just replacing the hands and feet and arms and legs of people on the floor. It's introducing how are we going to leverage the intellectual capital of all these people that have this seasoning, this expertise, this knowledge about how to get something done in the face of unexpected problems and challenges. So tapping into that relationship between what can an AI engine do really, really well, and how can it be supercharged or turbocharged by what a person can do and enable that to do even more. So it might do the work that it's expecting to do, but when those unexpected things come up, there's nothing like a person and being able to recognize all of that. And how is that going to really be tapped into? That's what gets really interesting in all of this, because we're not seeing AI adoption the way it's currently portrayed by even mainstream media, is that most manufacturers are experimenting with AI, but they're not doing it in their core value chain. They're doing it off the floor for the most part. They're doing it in sourcing areas and inventory management areas, not necessarily that they're right in the MES system or right in the SCADA system and changing processes on the fly, stopping something, starting something, accelerating something. all those types of things are still, in all likelihood, years away, given the pace of AI, next generation AI, if you will. That may be even sooner. AI has changed all of our perspective on timelines. But at this point in time, it's rare when we see somebody doing something right on the shop floor with AI. I think the best example of it is still computer vision, machine vision, where we're using AI algorithms to do pattern detection, anomaly detection, and whatnot. But that's been around for a long time and is just gradually being recognized. Okay, that really is a set of AI use cases as well. But that's still the dominant category of AI use case out on the floor.
Yeah, and I think definitely you mentioned earlier, it's something that everyone's trying to jump on. Everyone's trying to see how they can use it and involve it in their processes. But a lot of times, there's that difference of, what can we do with it now versus what do we ultimately want it to end up doing?
Yeah. And like with any generational technology, that learning curve is significant. So it's finding where does it fit in the risk reward profile right now? And can we do more off the shop floor and gradually introduce it to people? Can we introduce some of these concepts? Can we do things like instant foreign language detection and translation so that multilingual workers can collaborate more effectively? Can we contextualize standard operating procedures documentation so that instead of doing constrained searches, we can do something that in this moment, I can type in a prompt that says, these are the 3 major conditions I'm experiencing. Where does the SOP speak to this? Where do I need to go to in order to do this instead of trying to do limited search or indexing types of approaches? So there are some things that can be done that support the worker out on the floor. We're just seeing that begin to gain some momentum.
Yeah, and I've heard the analogy before where, we're at the point where AI can't go and build a house, but it can do a lot of the heavy lifting right now. It still takes someone to kind of screw the corners in together.
I think that's fair, and I think it does an exceptional job of filling out a lot of potential details, not the exact details, but areas to consider for comprehensiveness in being complete.
Yeah. I think there also is a pretty big disconnect, too, between what people kind of see in the general public as AI versus kind of the way it's applied in a lot of manufacturing environments. I guess, do you kind of see that where people might have a misunderstanding of what the technology itself even is?
Yeah, I think that that's the case. When you think about, whether, Chat GPT or things that are around the content generation side of things, that's just one aspect of AI. And I think that's where we'll see some of the early adoption, because it's not getting involved in activating processes. It's really just what types of tools can we give to people that are relevant and contextual. I think the big challenge that manufacturers are facing with this, as they consider AI, is the AI engine has to sit on a GPU somewhere. And this is where things get really challenging. This is where the compute side of things is just being presumed. And while there's a lot of attention being paid to these mega data centers, if I'm relying on my AI engine residing in one of these mega data centers somewhere, I got to get back and forth to my plant. And this connectivity and compute side of things is like I said, it's kind of being presumed, and it should be some of the early stage planning, because most manufacturers don't want to build out their server rooms or their computer rooms in their plant to support GPUs. They may not even have the power, because they want to dedicate the power to the manufacturing side of things, not to the computer side of things. Yet, because these GPUs consume so much power and generate so much heat, environmentally controlled environments for this compute infrastructure and finding the space for it could be problematic for a lot of manufacturers, and it creates more data centers than perhaps they want. On the other hand, if I'm going to do a round trip to some meta center somewhere, then I've got to consider, do I have enough bandwidth to get back and forth? Or can I land compute nearby with somebody who has infrastructure, somebody like Verizon that has this large footprint of infrastructure all over the place that could be tapped into to have that compute reside, it's what's called near edge or edge, instead of having it land on site. These are the conversations we're looking to have with manufacturers so that there isn't a gotcha where they've gone so far down the AI path and it's like, we haven't really considered what are we going to do about all this, and it delays their first mover advantage perhaps with an AI initiative.
Yeah. And so I guess in this situation, when Verizon Business kind of comes into the picture, what does that look like? I guess more so kind of an in-between for the companies in these data centers, or Verizon itself being kind of the host of these data centers?
Well, we don't host the data centers directly. We do have partnership agreements with most of the large hyperscalers where instances of their cloud environments can reside in our infrastructure. So it really comes down to where should the compute and the connectivity be that best supports the range of use cases. So instead of force fitting a particular use case into a certain model, 5G, for example, isn't going to be the best support for all use cases in an industrial environment. It could be the 4G LTE is, it could be that a wired connection still is, it could be that Wi-Fi is, or it could be that narrowband is. So aligning the connectivity and the compute to shape it against all those use cases is where we start, is understanding what are the use cases that will be the anchors to what you're trying to do. And then can we stack use cases on top of one another to drive sufficient business value for the investment, and then start to have those architectural conversations. So we want to try to have as many conversations to say, is this a problem that is A, worth solving, and B, is going to generate enough return with this type of a solution that it merits going forward? Back to that technical and functional discussion earlier, is that it's really exciting to talk about what something does and what's the art of the possible. But if we don't know that it's going to address a problem and create value, then we're back to having an interesting conversation versus that productive conversation.
Yeah. I was going to ask too, is with those conversations you have, is it maybe not super common, but do you often, have companies that kind of reach out looking for a kind of solution that you might offer and kind of having to tell them, you might not be ready for that yet, or you might not necessarily need the advancement that you think you do?
What we try to do is land on, are you trying to get educated and be prepared for the future? Or are you trying to solve something? What's your timeline to try to solve it? So when people see us at a conference, they carry certain perceptions of what we do and how we do it. They think of us as a consumer cellular type of provider. They presume that if we're going to provide cellular connectivity to a plant, that it's going to come from our public network. And the typical response is, well, the cell signal stinks. The tower is several miles away. And once I go inside the plant, nobody's signal really penetrates particularly well, given the thick walls we have and all the production machinery. So what we wind up doing is saying to a customer, but what if you could have that capability dedicated to your own needs? If you could have exclusive cellular access that is on site, and it doesn't really matter what's going on with the macro network. You don't have to concern yourself with the distance away. So we have those conversations at a manufacturing industry event. That tends to get the light bulb going on, the wheels turning, and people recognizing, oh, that means that I could do this. That means that I could accelerate that. What we tell people is that odds are when it comes to anything new in your plant, you probably have to cable it. And generally speaking, that's what they have to do. And we'll ask the customers frequently, how many new cabling drops do you do in a month? And the answers, as you can imagine, vary widely. But it's not uncommon for us to hear a manufacturer that's making 30 or 40 new cabling drops a month. Well, if you consider the time that consumes, the risk that it introduces, and the cost, it's a fairly unattractive yet best alternative to date. So now we're able to tell people is you're able to get that in sooner, create the value sooner, not incur additional recurring expenses as a result of it. And that's when the people start to say, okay, I could do this, this, and this. That use case acceleration, that's when they understand why we're at these types of events, because we're changing the dynamic of what might be possible and how to accelerate innovation in a meaningful way. Some of our best customers in this space are small and medium-sized manufacturers because they're able to enhance their agility and their flexibility because they don't want to be limited by the constraints of cabling. So it really appeals to that category of manufacturer, not just to the large manufacturer.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned too with the scalability that offers, where now that you have access to these dedicated networks, you can really kind of ramp up your internal scale of what's possible just by allowing that kind of connectivity.
When we consider the likelihood in that 5 to 7 year time frame of how many IoT sensors, vibration sensors, temperature sensors, humidity, gyro, location sensors, all the things that will be available and used at scale, and how many thousands of those devices are likely to be out on the shop floor, that presents a significant connectivity challenge. Am I going to cable all of that? Is that really what I want to do? Or am I going to rely on a shared resource, best effort wireless network? No, I probably want something that's more deterministic in nature. So what we share with customers is that a private cellular network can be just as deterministic and engineered in a way a wired network is. It's just going to give you that much more flexibility. And by the way, there's a sustainability impact here that every million linear feet of copper-based cabling contains 13 tons of copper. So when we think about how these types of projects can produce a measurable direct impact on ESG goals, if I can remove 13 tons of copper out of the mix, I've done something significant and measurable. So that's why we think that private cellular fits in this sweet spot for all these new emerging use cases.
Yeah, right at that forefront of kind of adaptability and modularity, without that
right.
hardwired presence that other solutions require.
Correct.
One thing I'm curious of is, what's the kind of requirement that this places on a company's, like their IT department, for example? Is this something that's going to kind of require a new dedicated employee, for example, or is it pretty straightforward to kind of be able to manage this into an existing company?
That's a real fair question. And it's a case of, number one, we're managing that spectrum on behalf of the customer. So we're treating that just as if it's another one of our towers. So our network operations centers are monitoring the performance and availability of all the signals that are being generated. We're not seeing the data. We're just monitoring the antennas, the radios, the private core, the baseband units, all the components that are going to be on site to ensure that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. The customer is controlling through a portal that we provide, adding resources, taking resources off, changing their settings, the profiles and whatnot. So there is a learning curve for taking that on, but we're generally finding it's not an additional dedicated resource because we're monitoring the network performance. And because this is treated as another segment on a customer's local area network on site, the network management tools that they have are often able to provide additional insight and control. So what we're finding is that it's not requiring that additional resource. It is requiring that somebody learn some about cellular technology, but that isn't necessarily a heavy lift for somebody that's already got a network foundation.
And I imagine with that too, you're also freeing up whoever's, going through and making those 30 cable drops a month.
Exactly. It's absolutely freeing them up. And with the the hybrid approach that I alluded to before of replacing a digital antenna system, we're actually simplifying networks with multiple functions being driven off of the same private wireless infrastructure.
Yeah. I wonder too, do you see kind of hesitancy, maybe at different levels within a company, but kind of that reluctance to adapt or to learn, kind of, wanting to stick to the classic, this is the way we've always done things mentality?
I'm going to separate from a brownfield environment in a greenfield environment. I'll start with the greenfield environment. With a new plant, that traditional thinking is structural in that typically the owner or the operator are relying on the architect and the general contractor and the rest of the design and engineering and construction teams to do things. And what happens is the low voltage cabling often gets farmed out to the electrical engineer who isn't as exposed to these new possibilities as they might be. So there is a kind of a knee-jerk response to this is the way we've always done it, so we're going to continue to do it this way. So we're trying to have more of those early stage conversations when it comes to a greenfield environment, or a more wireless approach to that and all of the benefits that accrue from that. From a brownfield environment, there is a resistance that's different in nature because every day they've got the same goals, the productivity, the safety, the quality, all of the things that have to happen every day. So is this a problem that is close enough, big enough, significant enough that they have to deal with it? Because it's so hard to do strategic projects in a plant because of the day-to-day requirements. So what we try to do is to identify, is there a collection of use cases that is so significant that you're tired of dealing with or have to change for a variety of reasons? And can we make that be a significant enough value proposition that it's worth you prioritizing your time? So we're finding that the resistance comes from people that know that they're problematic situations are, but that they're not severe enough that they have to spend time on it. The places where we're having that early success are the places where the problems are just too large to ignore. They've been going on too long. There's an inherent safety risk. There's enough of a quality aspect to this going on, or there's some type of constraint that the current way of doing things is no longer sustainable.
Yeah. And I imagine too, with, how vast of a diversity there is in manufacturing, whether it's automotive, aerospace, defense, anything like that, I imagine that's kind of pretty consistent among all of those where you have, different, kind of regardless of what the specific product is, that's kind of a shared conflict and a shared issue that all these manufacturers are facing.
I'd say it's a shared issue. I'd say that discrete manufacturers, it's probably something that's a little bit more pressing because in discrete manufacturing, because the worker is adding value at that moment in that workstation, they're not like in flow or in batch where there is more of a monitoring aspect to the work that they're doing. They're watching over the automation and such. Where in discrete, they're physically doing something or overseeing a process that physically does something. In that case, we see a little bit more collaboration, a little bit more, on the spot problem solving. Maybe not highly automated as those other types of manufacturing categories. But it's all a part of, if I'm going to expand a line, if I'm going to add additional automation, if I'm going to be able to cover all areas of my plant, some of those common thematic elements, like you referenced, are absolutely in play.
Yeah. And then maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but kind of what it makes me think of too is, if you're able to have a lot more communication and, connectivity within your assembly line, you go from kind of, having to have maybe an operator overseeing one specific operation to kind of being able to be a little bit further back and, to be able to kind of have more of a scope or kind of a greater field of view of what they're able to analyze because the data is able to be congregated a little more succinctly.
I think that's absolutely the case. If I can tap into those seniors' expertise, give them a broader field of vision, let them impact more of the operation, and rely on less experienced people, maybe to do some of that physical labor right there. But if I can give each role of worker the tools that they need to do that work, then I've been able to increase their value. One of the things that we're finding right now is in the area of digital natives and Gen Z employees is how are manufacturers meeting a digital native where they're at? We see this consistently where we'll ask a manufacturer, how long does it take somebody that's new to become considered fully productive, fully competent? And obviously it will change based on the role, but generally speaking, it seems to be around 6 to 8 months, 6 to 9 months is a typical answer for when people are 100% productive. And then we'll ask how long, or we'll ask them, what number of those people get to that anniversary date, get to that milestone? And the answers, Peter, are shocking. Generally speaking, half of the employees that they hire off the street don't make it to that milestone date. They don't get to 100% productivity, which means that the manufacturer is in this spiral. They're hiring the same person over and over again. They just have a different social security number. And the reality is that the amount of training costs, recruiting costs that is being lost is so significant. Some of these manufacturers will say that as many as 80% of the new hires aren't getting to that milestone date. And it's understandable because what we're asking a digital native to do is to put the device that they're so comfortable with, that they interact with the world through, to put that in a locker and for the next 8 to 8.5 hours, engage with the world in a completely different way. And that's not how younger generations of people that have grown up in technology solve problems, figure things out. So we'll ask a manufacturer, you've got a new hire and they have a problem at their workstation. Are they A, going to key on the two-way radio and let everybody know on the channel that they've got an issue? Are they B, going to walk around and have a conversation about it? Or C, are they going to try to access a video of how to do it, how to problem solve and fix it and do things on their own terms and be more self-sufficient? Well, obviously the answer is going to be C for these generations. And when we frame it that way to a manufacturer, it's going to, okay, that's a great way to illustrate the different work styles and how we have to accommodate different types of workers. But that presumes that we're giving them access to a device for them to use. And for a lot of manufacturers, that's a challenge of bringing devices out on the floor, back to the brackets of iPads and tablets sitting around. So recognizing what tools do we give somebody and how do we have that tool be used just for the work that they're doing, not for them to access the internet or create a distraction or a safety hazard. And there's different approaches to that. That's a problem. I won't say it's largely been completely solved, but there are definitely ways to mitigate that risk and to enhance the value of what we're trying to give workers, because we know that a more engaged worker is more likely to stay. And if they're more comfortable with a digital device, we can help manufacturers meet those digital natives where they are and create that win-win.
Yeah. And as someone who's written, a lot of trainings and kind of developed educational programs, I know that a lot of times, kind of like you mentioned, people will, they can grow frustrated and, find it difficult to kind of continue to learn if they don't have some kind of knowledge base that they can access. And a lot of times that might be an older employee, who's kind of able to show them the ropes, or, some kind of a reference that they can have for, if I have questions, if I have confusions. And a lot of times, that's something that might not be accessible, or you might have out-of-date training information. You might not necessarily have answers to kind of common questions that people might have, rather than just, do it this way because that's the way it should be done,
Right.
rather than kind of...
Exactly. And invariably, the challenge is going to pop up when the new worker is on their own. The buddy is off helping somebody else. They're somewhere else in the plant, and suddenly they're encountering this issue, and they know they have to get it solved fast, and they don't have the time to walk around. And they know that every time up to now, when they've solved a problem, they've gone to a source through their phone to figure it out, or to share it, or to do something really, really quickly. Because in that moment, you want to get to, how am I going to solve this as fast as possible? So if that's the go-to learning method, it's important to accommodate that.
Yeah, and definitely, in goals of, reducing the amount of people that are, dropping out of these companies, and to kind of minimize, the training resources, the training requirements, and to allow for a more efficient and direct onboarding process. I can definitely see how you're able to use these tools to that advantage, where you're able to maybe have more information present and accessible to this person, or you can have resources that they can get on demand,
Absolutely,
anywhere within this facility.
The way I put it is, if you look at the new person that has these tools, they're going to go and tell their friends and family what a cool new environment they're working in, that they get to do these types of things. Contrast that with the manufacturer where they don't have those types of tools. They're not as engaged. So not only do they leave, but they're going to tell everybody about how the experience wasn't that satisfactory. And that limits the manufacturer's recruiting pool as a result. So that word of mouth and that excitement that can be generated by using these technologies effectively can enhance the recruiting pool.
Yeah, and that's something that I think people might not make that initial connection of, adding some kind of secondary network to their plant, kind of directly relating to having higher success rates with their onboarding process, and, developing a more educational and, collaborative environment within their plant.
The better that a manufacturer understands these generations in terms of how they work, how they solve problems, that's going to inform AI engines. That's going to inform that effective marriage between a person and an AI engine.
Yeah. And maybe as we kind of bring things to a close here, one thing I always like to ask is just to kind of look forward and, with where we are today in the industry. And you've mentioned a few times, kind of the brief, kind of short-term future that we're able to offer and we're able to see, but kind of thinking a little bit longer term, is this something that it's basically going to be a standard with all manufacturing?
I think one of the things that is not as widely known or written about or spoken about is that the future manufacturing, especially on the plant floor, is going to be much more visual than it is today. And what I mean by that is, think about how human beings learn. We don't learn by absorbing letters and numbers, words, phrases, and such. We learn much more effectively, and we retain information longer through visual means. So going back to that digital native and that video, if we're going to learn that much more quickly and readily through that means, but we're also talking about technologies on the manufacturing floor like digital twin, computer vision, AR and VR, gamification techniques on tablets and such. All these visual components mean that there's going to be a lot more information and bigger files being generated on the floor and being uploaded, as well as video files and such being downloaded. When you consider that a video file is a much larger file than a text file, we're going to be taxing existing networks dramatically, but it's going to be driven by this demand that we have to have these visual technologies, whether it's Andon boards or Gemba boards that become, more visual in nature, whether it's going to be, I'm going to train somebody or walk them through a process by using gamification techniques so they're going to retain that information better. If it's going to be that I have to have more cameras out on the floor to capture not just the product and process, but views on the machinery itself and views on operator compliance to SOPs. There's a wide range of computer vision applications that'll be adopted. And I think there'll come a time where, with the right form factors for AR and VR headsets, that there'll be much more adoption of those as well. So that concept here that we're going to have something that's much richer in terms of visual content, that's one of the themes that executives will be able to gravitate towards. It's going to make people more efficient, more productive, more engaged, and safer, to be honest. So there's all these aspects to it, and I think it's a thread absolutely worth pulling on for what that future looks like.
Yeah, definitely a lot to be excited for when looking ahead for the future of manufacturing. Well, Michael, I appreciate you joining me here today. I appreciate the conversation. I've definitely learned a good deal, and hopefully our audience has as well.
Thanks for the opportunity, Peter. I've enjoyed it very much as well.
Yeah. And I'd also like to thank all of our listeners out there for tuning in week after week. Until next time, we'll see you then.
This podcast is brought to you by Promise Incorporated, hosted by Peter Parsons, produced by Lauren Rawl, and mixed and edited by Ben Parsons. If you have any questions or would like to appear on the podcast, please reach out to podcast@promiseinc.com. Thanks for listening.